What do you mean as a state sponsor of terrorism, though? How do you define terrorism?
Are we going to argue that Iran is literally the number one?
Is Iran committing genocide in Gaza right now, like the Israeli government is, which dragged us into this war, which every president prior...
number one sponsor of terrorism.
For 47 years, the Iranians have killed Americans and our allies across this world.
Okay.
They're trying to obtain nuclear weapons so they can annihilate Israel and potentially...
In today's video, Emma Vigeland annihilates Pete Seat on CNN's Newsnight. Emma Vigeland's side really lands when you look at how inconsistent US policy has been in this region for years. We've seen moments where military pressure ramps up, but the diplomatic goals aren't clearly defined. And that's where things start to fall apart. Because history shows when you mix unclear objectives with high-stakes conflicts, it doesn't just create confusion, it drags things out. But before we dive into today's video, make sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one.
Then so if the president and Secretary Rubio can utilize the steps that they're going through the diplomatic process, they have the Pakistanis working to do these negotiations. And I believe in my heart of hearts that the president does want this to come to an end without having to do boots on the ground. But I also will tell you this president is a president of action. We've seen past administrations use big words and things and say that they draw lines in the sand and all these things if Iran does something. This president means business. If Iran rears its ugly head and attempts to continue doing what they've done for many, many years as the number one state sponsor of terrorism, this president will take action. I don't want that to happen. I don't think anyone at this table or any of the American public wants that to happen, but everyone should be on notice that this is a president of action who will, in fact, do what he needs to do to carry out his mission of protecting the American public.
What do you mean as a state sponsor of terrorism, though? How do you define terrorism?
Are we going to argue that Iran is literally the number one?
Is Iran committing genocide in Gaza right now, like the Israeli government is, which dragged us into this war, which every president prior...
number one sponsor of terrorism.
For 47 years, the Iranians have killed Americans and our allies across this world.
Okay.
They're trying to obtain nuclear weapons so they can annihilate Israel and potentially capitals in Europe.
There's no evidence of that. The JCPOA was actually a successful deal that Obama
I find it appalling
negotiated.
that you're an Iranian apologist.
Yeah, this is so. There's nothing I can do that call out Israel's genocide and then everybody swarms.
No.
This is the one thing that you can't say. It's the one thing you can't say. It is about Gaza. This is about a regional conflict that's spiraling out of control that the president is adding to.
But you stated that there's no evidence that Iran wants nuclear weapons. They lied.
There has been a religious edict that has said since 2003 that they should not be creating a nuclear weapon.
They lied to the United Nations. They lied to the international...
We killed the Ayatollah, the older father, who was actually against building a nuclear weapon because he thought that it was going to contribute here.
I'm genuinely shocked that you are defending the Iranians. And I got to tell you, I hope that you tuck yourself in at night under that pillow of lies that you just told about the Iranians. That is absolute a crock of a word I can't say on national television.
So the United States is funding a government that an Israeli human rights group that B'Tselem says is committing genocide, as is Amnesty International, as is every credible human rights group right now. We are there's a massacre in Gaza. There are hundreds of thousands of people unaccounted for under rubble. That's what I define as terrorism. Now, Iran is now exerting their leverage over the Strait of Hormuz.
Is Hezbollah a terrorist organization?
Do you want the Iranians to have a nuclear weapon, yes or no?
Thousands of people that have died at the hands of Iran disagree with your personal description of what terrorism is. And I'm sorry, it doesn't meet the bill of what it actually
killing
is.
civilians is what I define it as a diplomat.
When people throw around terms like number one sponsor of terrorism, even US intelligence reports tend to be more nuanced than that. Yes, Iran has supported proxy groups like Hezbollah, but at the same time, global terrorism data from groups like the Global Terrorism Index consistently shows that Sunni extremist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda have been responsible for the majority of attacks and casualties over the past decade, not Iran-backed networks. That doesn't excuse Iran's actions, but it does challenge the idea that they're the singular or dominant force globally. And on the nuclear issue, it's not as black and white as it's being portrayed either. The JCPOA deal in 2015 didn't just hope Iran would behave, it had some of the most intrusive inspection mechanisms ever put in place. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, repeatedly verified that Iran was complying with uranium enrichment limits before the US withdrew from the deal. After that withdrawal, enrichment levels started increasing again, which shows how much of this situation is tied to policy decisions, not just intent. Then there's the regional angle Emma is getting at. The Middle East isn't just one conflict, it's overlapping ones. You've got Gaza, Israel, Iran, Gulf states, and global powers all tied together. And historically, when the US leans heavily into military pressure without a clear diplomatic track, like in Iraq in 2003 or Libya in 2011, it often creates power vacuums that make regional instability worse, not better. Even economically, this all feeds back into the global system. The Strait of Hormuz alone carries about 20% of the world's oil supply, so any escalation there doesn't just hit one country. It spikes global energy prices, which affects everything from inflation to food costs worldwide. That's why these decisions aren't just about security, they're about long-term global consequences. So the bigger point here is that reducing this to good versus bad actors, or action versus inaction, oversimplifies a situation that's way more complex. Because if the strategy isn't consistent, if it shifts between diplomacy and escalation without a clear endgame, you don't just risk conflict, you risk getting stuck in one.
Yeah. Former diplomat and former advisor at the Department of Defense who has worked in the region and worked on all these issues. Two things can be true at the same time. The United States is supporting an Israeli government that has violated international law and is committing war crimes, and Iran is a state sponsor of terror, right? Those are both true. These are the realities the United States has had to reckon with for decades of U.S. foreign policy. It is also why the United States has not ever put its hand on the lever in such a hard way as to bring the war to Iran that Iran has been itching for, because Iran is able to defend. It is now had all the possible folks who would have revolted and overthrown the regime. They suddenly woke up one day to having everything around them bombed. There was no CIA or Mossad effort to actually support a proper uprising, which is frankly what the United States did with the Shah. So we know we have the capability of doing that. None of that planning or strategy existed. We had U.S. embassies being attacked by drones and on fire in allied countries because our allies had no idea this was happening. So the United States went all in on something that Benjamin Netanyahu has wanted for decades. Yep. And we're calling that action and strong. And guess what? The president of the United States, the commander-in-chief, wants to walk away from that right now.
There's
no indication of that.
When the president of the United States calls this, what we are seeing right now, a victory that is entirely rhetoric, that is entirely spin. Military capabilities have absolutely been degraded. Absolutely true. But we are seeing economic impacts, we are seeing downstream effects, we are seeing impacts to the American public without any effort having been made to convince the American public that this was necessary.
Terry, hold on, Terry. The one thing you need in a president in wartime is credibility. And Trump is all over the map, right? First it was unconditional surrender and regime change. Now, we won. Carolyn Levitt is out there saying the Iranians are defeated and will continue to be defeated. He says, I'm going to end this war. Don't worry, it's not going to last that long. He does not know what to do. And he says he was surprised that Iran, which has been waiting for this moment for a long time, and anyone who spent any time there, anyone who's read a book, knows that the war they wanted was against the other Gulf states. Trump says nobody knew they were going to bomb UAE or Saudi or whatever. Of course they are. And the notion that it's won already or that they're defeated, they just bombed a U.S. airbase.
Historically, the U.S. has always treated Iran as a complicated adversary, not something you just escalate into a direct war with and expect a clean outcome. Even during peak tensions, multiple administrations avoided full-scale conflict because Iran's strength isn't just military, it's asymmetric warfare. Groups like Hezbollah or regional militias give Iran the ability to respond indirectly, which is exactly why conflicts involving Iran tend to spread across borders instead of staying contained. And that point about civilians matters more than people realize. Independent groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have repeatedly documented that in modern conflicts, civilian casualties often make up the majority of deaths, especially in densely populated areas like Gaza. That's not just a moral issue, it actually changes the strategic outcome. Civilian harm tends to increase radicalization and prolong conflicts, which is something US military studies themselves have acknowledged. There's also the credibility issue they're hinting at, and that's huge. If you look at past wars, from Iraq to Afghanistan, one of the biggest problems wasn't just strategy, it was shifting narratives from leadership. When objectives keep changing, first regime change, then deterrence, then mission accomplished, public trust drops fast. And once that credibility is gone, it becomes way harder to sustain support, both domestically and with allies. And speaking of allies, the lack of coordination they're pointing to is a real red flag. In previous major operations, whether it was the Gulf War or even coalition efforts against ISIS, the US made sure allies were looped in early. When allies are caught off guard, it doesn't just weaken the coalition, it can actually destabilize the region further, especially in places like the Gulf, where multiple countries are directly exposed. Then you've got the economic ripple effects. Conflicts tied to Iran almost always impact the Strait of Hormuz, which carries about a fifth of the global oil.
I just say real
quick, the enemy always gets a say.
I disagree, Terry, with you, because in this situation, I think the fact that the president can be confusing in his language, that he contradicts himself and his subordinates, is intentional. It's deliberate deception. And when you're in the midst of a negotiation...
Hold on. Is he deliberately deceiving the American public? Is he deliberately deceiving
the Iranians?
Congress?
You're in the midst of a negotiation. And trust me, I know we're all impatient. We talk about this conflict. It's only been 4 weeks. We talk about it like it's been 4 years. And we're impatient. We want certainty. We want to know what's coming next. But so do the Iranians.
That's true, but here's the thing.
We cannot tell them. We can't tip our hat.
The reason I think why people are impatient is because they didn't know it was coming. The American public was not sold on this. Congress was not sold on this.
And that means the Iranians didn't know it was coming. No. Mind you, we were putting forces in the Middle East.
But wait a minute. But you've also got Nancy Mace, who has said that Iran is becoming an Iraq. That's how she sees it. Now, that's her opinion. That's her opinion.
Again, it's been 4 weeks. But she can take a chill pill.
Understood. But if you have someone who has been a great supporter of Donald Trump saying this, then certainly the American public is looking at this and wondering, why are we here? And now that we are here, now what? Because gas is going up, right? There are economic issues that are hitting Americans in ways that they thought that Donald Trump was going to solve. So how do you explain to them that this is going to be for the better good?
$11 billion a day, right? Like, that's part of the explanation. What are we doing with $11 billion a day? What has the American public gained in safety and security that it did not have a month ago?
All of the points that have been made here, we're in a very cordial debate, and I think that all of the points have been heard and well taken, except this one. There can be no ambiguity. There can be no question. And the American public, I think, is sitting at home watching this, gripping their chairs at the idea that you are a Iranian sympathizer. And the people
gripping their chairs?
The people that, and it's not funny. The idea of what the, and that's scary. The idea of what the Iranian regime has done around the world, not just to Americans, but to their own people. You talked about rights and things. They killed 30,000 people.
I don't defend the Iranian government, but the reason that we have this government is because they reinstalled the Shah.
He asked you a question about, do you want Iran to have a nuclear bomb? And
the reason this government exists is because I don't want anyone to. We should have denuclearization across the board, and Israel shouldn't have.
You guys are really piling on Emma, because I have not heard either one of you say anything critical of either the U.S. military operation right now, either the fact that Israel has more of a plan and a strategy, and the United States, which is supposed to be leader, is following Israel. I mean, come on.
If you look at history, whenever the U.S. enters a situation without clearly explaining the why to the public, it almost always leads to long-term frustration. That happened with Iraq in 2003, where the original justification shifted over time and public trust dropped hard once people felt like they weren't getting straight straight answers. The same pattern in Afghanistan. Objectives kept evolving, and eventually even policymakers admitted there wasn't a clear endgame. And that matters here because public buy-in isn't just a political thing. It actually affects outcomes. Studies from the Rand Corporation and other defense analysts have shown that wars without strong domestic support tend to last longer and become harder to sustain, both financially and strategically. Then there's the economic side she's hinting at, which hits people immediately. When tensions spike in the Middle East, especially around Iran, it almost always affects the Strait of Hormuz, where roughly 20% of global oil supply passes through. Even the risk of disruption can push oil prices up, and that trickles down fast. Gas, shipping, groceries. So when people feel that impact without understanding the purpose behind it, that disconnect grows even bigger. And on the strategy question, that's another key point. In past major operations, the US typically led with a clearly defined coalition strategy. Think the Gulf War or even coordinated campaigns against ISIS. When it starts to feel like the US is reacting instead of leading, or aligning behind another country's timeline without clearly communicating its own goals, it raises real concerns about who's actually steering the bigger picture. Even the negotiation argument doesn't fully close that gap. Yes, ambiguity can be part of diplomacy, but there's a difference between being strategically vague to adversaries and being unclear to your own public and lawmakers. Historically, successful negotiations, like the Iran nuclear deal in 2015, still involved briefings, transparency with Congress, and a defined framework, even if every detail wasn't public.